Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a few more minutes. All right, we can get started now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's event, which is part of Enterprises and CHS's training series, Housing as a Pathway to Justice. My name is Camila Fernandez, and I'm a program officer with Enterprise Community Partners. And for today's event, we'll discuss the wide range of funding streams available to support the development and ongoing management of affordable housing projects. The facilitators and speakers we have for today will provide some sort of tactical strategies for identifying appropriate funding streams. And also we'll talk about some lending considerations you should keep in mind when you're thinking about taking on these projects. I'll start with a presentation just going over the housing continuum, just briefly going over some of the basics or acronyms and terms that are used in this space, just to set some base level understanding. And then I'll turn it over to a presentation from Benjamin Mitch, who's the Vice President of Housing Development and Risk Management at Fortune. And he's accompanied also by Andrew Ward, who's the Associate Vice President of the David Rosenberg Center for Public Policy at Fortune. And then we'll end today's event with a presentation from Katya Izumova, who's the Director of Loan Fund with Enterprise Community Partners, and she'll talk about a little bit about the lending considerations. So just to get us started here, we often hear about the housing continuum where people ideally move from temporary to permanent stable housing. However, this sort of smooth transition or movement across the continuum is not really a reality for most people. But we'll use this language of the housing continuum to help us better understand some of the housing options that exist. And I'll talk a little bit about temporary housing options, permanent housing options today, again, just to give you a sense of the vocabulary and the resources. So let's start with temporary housing. And here we'll break temporary housing into three main categories. The first is safe havens. So safe havens are generally geared towards people who are street homeless or maybe are cycling between street homelessness, jails, and hospitals. They tend to have to be considered very low threshold options that are designed to accommodate individuals who are having a little more challenge coming off the streets. And so generally they have lower requirements than traditional shelters. There's no curfew and there's a little more flexibility in that you can miss a night without losing your place. And the idea is to expose people to services, whether it be intensive case management, mental health, or substance use services, in order to encourage them or connect them to these services, and in doing so, move them to other forms of housing options. Now, safe havens, the resources are very limited. They are a few in New York City. There are some federal funding for it, but generally speaking, it is meant to target the street homeless population. Other than safe havens, there's the more traditional shelters or transitional housing. And in New York City, it's primarily going to be funded by the Department of Human Services. But there's also state resources and federal resources to fund transitional housing. So these are short term. And when I say short term, I think in New York City, the average shelter stay is probably like 2 years right now. And this is for individuals and families, and they may be scattered or congregated. So we'll go over this a little bit later on, but just really briefly, scattered is essentially when a nonprofit or a contract holder operates multiple units across multiple buildings, and congregated is just sort of all in one building. There's also a wide range of ownership and operating models across the country. So typically in New York and elsewhere, the cities will contract with nonprofits to operate the shelter and provide case management. However, the ownership and how it's structured, again, it varies a lot. Oftentimes, a nonprofit will work with a for-profit owner to master lease a unit in a building or entire building to use it as a shelter. There's also some city-owned shelters, and there's some shelters that are actually owned and operated by the nonprofits themselves. So again, in New York City, the big share of money for transitional shelters, it's going to be coming from the Department of Homeless Services. There's also some HUD money, which is usually funneled through the local continuum of care, which is sort of the umbrella entity, region by region, that manages federal money that is allocated for homelessness. Though interesting, I just want to mention that in the last decade, federal resources have communicated a clear priority for permanent supportive housing. So in the shelter world has seen some of its federal resources sort of pushed out because of that. The last temporary housing option that I want to briefly discuss are halfway houses. These generally support federal prison detainees, and they're residential facilities where people are actually required to go live before re-entering the community. Most of the funding for this is federal or federally flowing through states. And in New York, it's typically the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, and they can be operated by nonprofits and for-profits. Though in certain states like New Jersey, there are certain restrictions where only nonprofits are allowed to operate halfway houses. The last thing I'll say about halfway houses is that they're a pretty niche area, and regulation does vary heavily state to state. And so there are places where they get a bad reputation, but they're certainly fulfilling a need. All right, just to go over some resources. Any sort of DHS RFP is really going to go through the HHS accelerator requirement. And if your organization has not signed up and you're operating in New York City, we do recommend that you sign up so that your organization has access to these funding opportunities. Typically, those are going to be very competitive applications, and the funding can range from upfront capital money to buy something or to build something. But more typically, it's going to be going for services, ongoing service contracts for your nonprofit to operate. There's also H2J in New York City, and they often offer opportunities for post-incarceration service funding or rental assistance for individuals. So that's another good place to follow and be on top of. And then if you're interested in becoming an owner or operator of a shelter, there is the sample DHS long-term contract that we've linked here. Again, this has very New York City specific language, but I mean, some of it is pretty a general sort of template that can be used for those that are interested in exploring or wanting to dig deeper into this space. And we've provided some links here, and of course, we'll be sharing the slides after this event so that you guys can have a chance to dig through them. All right, then let's talk about permanent housing. So permanent housing is also a very confusing place, especially because the justice system and the homeless system are not always in communication. And permanent housing in and of itself is just a very broad umbrella, and there's lots of acronyms that are also thrown around in here. So we'll briefly go over some of them. All right, so we'll start with public housing, which is owned, constructed, and operated by a public entity. And they are very strict eligibility processes in New York City and elsewhere. The waiting lists are incredibly long. So someone can apply, and then there's income restrictions, and those applications are good for 2 years. But in New York City, the Housing Authority applicants, they're assigned a priority code for interview based on their application info, like their household size, their family composition, citizenship. And people can be waiting for an interview for years. Unfortunately, it's just a very scarce resource. And while it's great when you are accepted into it because you pay 30% of your income towards rent, getting into public housing can be very difficult. There's also supportive housing, right? So this is dedicated affordable housing with on-site social services in place for individuals or families who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. Though typically in New York City, this resource is often prioritized for individuals who are homeless. Typically, it's sort of operated by nonprofits that have a long service contract, and oftentimes there is a rental subsidy that is tied to a specific project for the tenants. Again, the qualifications for supportive housing can really vary on where you are. And in New York City, we can talk about how oftentimes people who are cycling between prison, jails, and hospitals, they're sort of excluded from this resource, again, because of some of the eligibility requirements, and we'll go over that a little bit later in the presentation. There's also conventional affordable housing, and in New York and certainly elsewhere, both in the city and we know that city and state make loans to nonprofits and for-profit developers to place regulatory agreements, and they require that those units be available to folks within certain income levels. So those income levels are based on something that is called the area median income, AMI. And in New York City, and this is true elsewhere, the AMI is for like a whole city. And so in New York City, we have instances where 100% AMI is for New York City. Again, it's about $83,600. And again, this is a salary that not a lot of our clients are working with. And the corresponding rent, so the 30% for someone at that salary level will be about $1,700 per studio. So while it is a great resource, I think it really does depend on what income folks have. And it's a very scarce resource. People in New York City apply through Housing Connect, and the average sort of wait is 500 applications to one available unit. So not to sound discouraging, but again, it's also a scarce resource. And while it's great that the city keeps on building affordable housing, it's only one small piece of the puzzle. And then there's market rate housing. So for folks who are low income, they can typically access those market rate units when they have a voucher. In New York City, there's City FIPS, which is a voucher that folks in shelter often are linked to. There's also Section 8, which is provided through a variety of entities. New York City HPD has them. But again, there's long waiting list. And I think as many of you know, technically source of income is illegal, but we see discrimination happen all the time. And so finding a partner or landlord can be very challenging. So just to go over some of the resources, the state funds are a great deal. The state actually funds a great deal of affordable housing, and the link here provides an overview of those programs. Also, if you ever need like a quick reference of acronyms, even if you are outside of New York, I really do love this Affordable Housing 101 glossary of acronyms that is offered by NYSAFA. Also, the Furman Center has a great directory of housing resources and programs. And lastly, federal funding is still very critical in this space of homelessness and supportive housing. So linked here is an overview of some of those federal funding resources. And again, we'll be sharing these slides with you guys. Okay, so in New York and elsewhere, a lot of the supportive housing prioritizes folks who are chronically homeless. And so I'm just gonna give a quick sort of advocacy plug in here. The federal definition of chronically homeless requires that someone be homeless for at least 1 year or twice in 4 years, but it does not include time spent in correctional facilities. And so if someone is cycling through homelessness, they sort of lose their homelessness count as soon as they go to prison or hospital or like a hospital or jail. And so for that matter, we see many times in New York City, the folks that may have a need for supportive housing, they often get excluded because they don't meet this public definition of chronically homeless. And we wanted to flag this for you guys in the advocacy space. If you're thinking about places to advocate and where there are gaps, this is certainly a big one in New York and across the country as well. So just a couple other terms that get thrown around, and I want to provide some clarification. There's scattered and congregate. We talked a little bit about this before. So basically scattered are apartments that are scattered through different buildings, and congregate is all in one building. Also, there's this difference between lease and own, which really speaks to the structure of operating. So oftentimes we'll see nonprofits contracting with for-profits. And in the leasing option, there's less risk. Usually there's shorter term contracts. And so if the marriage is not working out, you can leave. And you're not always responsible for like taxes or maintenance. And if like the boiler breaks, it would be like on the landlord to replace that. But in the leasing option, you also have less control. When you own something, it means for the owning option here, you have the asset. So it means you have more responsibility for maintaining it. And usually the sort of threshold to own something is financially higher. So when we make a loan, when enterprise, for example, makes a loan to a nonprofit, we're typically looking that they have at least $1 million in assets already. And I know that's often a hard barrier to sort of achieve and get past. So lastly, I think I'll just end this by saying that it's not a one size fits all conversation. So every building, every organization, every client, they all have different needs. And if your organization has any questions or you're sort of interested in exploring development, feel free to reach out to me, and also our partners with CHS will be more than happy to help you guys through these processes. All right, and with that, I just want to go ahead and pass it to Andrea and Ben with Fortune, and they'll go a little more in depth into some of these topics. So Ben and Andrea.
Thank you, Camila. Really, it's an honor for us to be here today to present to this group. In hearing Camila's introduction, one can think that this is a very large area, a large space, and it's hard in this short period of time to get our arms around the whole thing, but we'll do the best we can to try and introduce everyone to what the process is in terms of going into a development phase of a project. But I also, first, before I start, I wanted to note that on the call, besides Andre Ward, who is our Fortune's Associate Vice President of Public Policy at the David Rothenberg Center on Public Policy, we also have Tamara Green, who is our Chief Program Officer, and also John Smallwood, who's our Senior Director of Real Estate Development. I will say this, to Fortune, housing is a critical issue. When you look at reentry and successful reentry, housing, safe and affordable and good housing is key to successful reentry. One of the things we've been thinking about at Fortune, and in order not to think about this, because you look at the population of people who have criminal justice involvement, it's very large. And I think the thinking on this is now changing because we're also looking at discrete subgroups within that population now. It's not just the whole population itself, but also there are subset groups which have different needs within that population. And how do we address those specific housing needs that are different? And I can give you two examples of where Fortune has looked at this. We have just opened in the Bronx at 1080 Washington a project we did with a for-profit developer, which provided 57 units of housing for individuals who are coming out of long-term incarceration, meaning they're older when they come out. So why is this important? Because we know that long-term incarceration has very traumatic effects on individuals, but also from health effects, someone who's been in for a long time tends to come out with long-term chronic health issues. And if they were just to be put out when they were released out of incarceration, out into the street or into a shelter, we know that the results for those individuals would be, unfortunately, not good. So we've created a specialized housing model for individuals who are coming out of long-term incarceration. We did this with the state because the state recognized that when they were trying to release individuals out of prison who had these long-term stays, they had nowhere to go. So they came to Fortune a number of years ago. We came up with this idea, and it actually works. And we think it's an excellent proof of concept for developing more housing in that area. And then secondly, we have seen that individuals who are on Rikers and are there, many of them have also long-term health needs or issues that preclude them from being released out of Rikers because they have nowhere to go, which can meet their health needs. So we are working on a project called Just Home, again in the Bronx at the Jacoby Hospital Center, where Fortune will be rehabilitating a building and creating housing for individuals who are coming out of incarceration with these medical needs. So as you're looking at getting into this area and developing, and we want everyone, as many organizations, to get into this area as possible, maybe what the thinking is not always to look at the whole population, but to see if you could create housing for a discrete subset in the population. where there is an unmet need. So that's one of the things we've been thinking about. We do provide general housing in addition to individuals who don't have specific needs for the population, but it's something we've been thinking about. The second area, and I let Andre speak about this, is there is no way we're going to be able to build our way out of this problem. It's just impossible. The need is too great. So what do you do if you can't build your way out and create housing that's going to meet this unmet need? It's through advocacy, and it's through changing the system, which is preventing individuals with criminal justice history from attaining quality housing in the marketplace. And I'll let Andre talk about some of the unique actions that our public policy center is taking to help change the systemic problems that this population is facing.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ben, too. And as you're talking about, this, Ben, I'm made to reflect on just the sheer amount of people that have conviction histories in New York City, right? There were 750,000 people in New York City that had conviction histories. That's about 11% of the adult population, 80% of whom are Black and Latinx. And when we think about the need for housing, especially for this population, we understand how fundamentally critical it is to make sure people have access. The other part of it is, in terms of our unique housing structure, right? We know, like for folk in New York City in particular, coming out of Rikers Island, about 48% of the people that are there have a mental health diagnosis. So there's a need for support in our housing for people to be engaged and have their mental health needs addressed. So all of that to say, having housing for people with conviction histories is critically important. And we have been involved in a campaign to advance what is called Fair Chance for Housing legislation, more specifically the Fair Chance for Housing Act, that would end the practice of discriminating against people with conviction histories when they're trying to access housing. Last year, we had gotten to a point where we were kind of close, but the bill died at the floor, unfortunately, for a vote. Now, however, the bill has gotten traction. And with the new class of city council members who understand the need for housing for our folks, we have around 31 sponsors for the bill. We have 4 borough presidents, the public advocate, and the comptroller, all of whom are supporting this critically important piece of legislation. We're looking to have this bill come to the floor for a vote in March, and are hopeful that this legislation will pass because there is proof of concept in terms of this legislation working in places like Seattle in particular and DC. And so we want to make sure that New York City in particular is supporting this legislation. But we also know that this legislation has national implications, and that what we're seeing and experiencing in New York City relative to people not being able to access housing because of conviction histories is also a national phenomenon. So I'll turn it back to you, Ben, for that. And we also, just before I give it back to Ben, involved in litigation as it relates to ensuring that the bad actors that are housing developers are not discriminated against our people with conviction histories. So we are involved in ensuring that the bad actors are held accountable, not solely because of money necessarily, but to get people to change their policies as bad actors. So we have also litigated and won and had some victories, a couple of which one was our Sandcastle lawsuit, where we had sued a large housing developer for being engaged in unlawful practices of discrimination against our folk. And we continue to do that as a part of our advocacy efforts. And with that, I'll turn it back to Ben.
Yeah, and I would say this litigation is extremely important because getting this population access to market rate housing is one of the ways we can help solve this unfortunate problem. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, and I really appreciate Camilla's introduction and her beginning part to this webinar, is Fortune is a big believer in the continuum of housing. The way we've structured our housing program and the way we operate is we recently opened in our transitional housing building a 37-bed DHS shelter. We recognize that a lot of our population was in the shelter system, and we knew that people with criminal justice history had unmet needs in the shelter system. So we went through the process. It took 2.5 years to open a DHS shelter in our building. This was also necessary, and it's unfortunate, and Camilla talked about it. There's been a pullback of funds for transitional housing. We're seeing less funding available for that type of housing. So to offset that funding decrease, we had to balance the building out with a DHS shelter. But it's been a learning experience for us. We are learning how to work with DHS and how best to serve our population. And besides, so we have that in addition to our transitional housing, which is COC, which was what Camilla also discussed. It's plus we have HASA beds, which are dedicated for individuals who have HIV. But the goal of the transitional housing and the emergency shelter housing is to get people better situated to be in permanent housing. And the ultimate goal is to get people into permanent, affordable, and supportive housing. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Fortunate has the Castle Gardens, which is located in West 140th Street in Harlem, which is a affordable supportive building, which has both affordable units for the community and supportive units for individuals with criminal justice history. And I'll go through the other projects we have in our pipeline right now, which are addressing the permanent housing shortage for this population. The next slide. All right, so today want to try, and one thing I will try and avoid is the alphabet soup. One of the things I realized when I started in this about 6 years ago, I remember the first call I was on, people started talking in all these acronyms. I had no idea what they were talking about. And I felt like completely lost because they were speaking almost a foreign language. I'm going to try to do the best I can not to drop into the foreign language and to start speaking in acronyms. But I think Camilla's right. I think it's an ISAFA resource is excellent. Also, I've created an acronym dictionary, which if anybody's interested in getting, I can send out to the group after. So please bear with me. I will try not to do that, but it's out of bad habit that you tend to fall back into the acronyms. But what we're looking at here, when we're looking at an affordable and supportive housing project, these are the major, it's a puzzle that you have to put together. I wish there was just one place to go where you could get all of your funding, all of your supportive service funding, your building funding. It's not that way. So every building's a puzzle. How do you make it work from a financial standpoint? How do you make it work from a service standpoint? And also make it work for the community that you're looking to build in. All of these are very important parts to creating a successful, affordable, supportive building. So if we look at the different areas we're talking about, you have land property acquisition, pre-development cost, construction financing, permanent financing, rent subsidies, and supportive housing funding. And I will preface that today saying what I'm talking about here is a snapshot of this. It's not exhaustive. There's far more to talk about than we really can accomplish in this webinar today. But I think it's a good introduction because part of the reason why a lot of nonprofits have not gotten into this field is they look at this and think it's completely daunting. And I think organizations get scared that it's something too big to take on, but it's not. And I think what we're trying to demystify here is the process, and also think about how you can structure partnerships maybe with for-profit developers where the non-for-profit is not taking the whole risk of the project itself. And we've done both types of projects where we've partnered with for-profit developers and ones where we have been the developer ourselves as a nonprofit. Next slide, please. Well, the key to starting a project is finding a piece of property. So it can take its form in many different ways. It could be a empty lot somewhere in the city where you want to build, or it can be taking a building that already exists and rehabilitating it to create affordable and supportive housing. We have projects in the pipeline right now that are doing both. We have in East Harlem on 123rd Street, the city, through an RFP we applied for a long time ago, we were awarded a piece of property on East 123rd Street. Because it was awarded through an RFP and we were making a zoning change to allow for us to have additional space in the building, we had to go through what the city of New York calls ULURP, which is the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. And it's a process by which, if you are, as I just said, acquiring the land, getting the land from the city of New York through a designation, or you're changing a zoning designation, you have to go through this process. And it involves working with the community board in the area, getting community board approval, and ultimately going through the process with the different zoning and different agencies of the city, ultimately landing at the city council and the mayor's office. It takes about a year, maybe a little longer, to go through that process. But if you're getting land for free as part of an RFP, it's well worth that process. Because as we know, land acquisition costs in the city could be very expensive. So if you want to learn more about ULURP, feel free to reach out to me. I think there's also, I put some in later on in the project, some resources where you can go to. So what do you do once you find a piece of land, say the city doesn't give it to you, or a building? Well, you need to figure out how you're going to acquire it. That's part of the process. I will say this, and putting a plug in for Enterprise here, they help facilitate. We purchased during COVID an illegal hotel on the Upper West Side, and Enterprise, through the New York City Acquisition Fund, helped us to acquire that property. And it's an excellent funding availability. It allows a nonprofit like us to be able to go and purchase such a building, which we never thought we'd be able to do. And so as part of that process is finding an acquisition lender who will help you obtain the land or obtain the building. Next slide, please. Here is a much more detailed description of ULURP, and it essentially goes through the process of how you, if you're getting the land transferred from the city or there's a zoning designation change, how you go through the process. You have to make an application to the New York City Department of Planning. It's an environmental impact statement. I can go through all of this. Essentially, it's a process where you usually get some help. As part of your development team process, we hired a land use attorney who is well-versed in guiding agencies like Fortune through the ULURP process. And I can tell you this, and part of the key to doing this type of development is the development team you put together. Fortune does not have the in-house capability to do this full development program. We're lucky now, and I introduced John Smallwood, who's on the call. We've added depth to our program because we are getting more and more real estate opportunities. And John brings a huge amount of real estate experience to us at Fortune, and we're very lucky to have him with us. But we're not architects, we're not land use attorneys, we're not environmental companies that look at the environmental parts of the project. So as you're thinking about doing this, one of the keys is being able to put together a strong development team. And that will help power your project forward. And we've done that on all of our projects. And I'll put a plug in. We use Curtis Ginsburg as our architect on our projects. Amy Laravere, who's been our development consultant. She is excellent. AKRF, who's done our environmental. And we've done solar with both Bright Power and Cosentini. But all of these parts of these projects, you need to make sure you have a strong development team. And it's very important that that they're in place, because that could be the key to having a successful project. Next slide, please. Pre-development costs. Well, you're thinking, now I want to get into this business, how do I pay for all this? How do I pay for an architect to do initial drawings? How do I pay for the environmental company to go out and take a look? Question. It depends. We went through ULURP during COVID, which presented different challenges on our project and end up spacing out to about 18 months to go through. I think it could be a little shorter now that things are back in person. We had trouble because of COVID scheduling community board meetings and getting the approvals through. So I think it could be a little bit shorter now, but it was a little more of a daunting task through COVID. And unfortunately, I think it's better now. And we learned a lot going through ULURP the first time here. I think if we went through it again, we understand where the pain points are and how to better move it through the bureaucracy. But you're looking at 12 to 18 months probably to get through the process.
That's not bad.
It's not bad, but it's still when you're we unfortunately on our East Harlem project, we also faced litigation at the beginning from a neighbor. So besides 18 months of ULURP, we also had a year delay fighting them in court where they thought they could take the property through adverse possession against the city, which they realized at the end when it was thrown out that adverse possession does not work against the city. You can't do that. But they were so obstinate and it cost us a year of time to have to litigate that. So unfortunately, and this is the other part of it, I will say this, and I expect the unexpected when you're doing real estate development. You think you have everything lined up, something else goes into a different direction. And what I've learned from going through this is when you think you have everything lined up, you think it's ready to go, something's going to happen. And you just have to be ready to address those things, be creative in your thinking, and have very good people working on the project so you can deal with it. But that is just the nature of this process.
So, sorry, one more question, if you
Sure.
don't mind. So land use attorneys can be extraordinarily expensive.
I'll give you what we did with that.
Okay. Yeah.
The land use attorney we went to quoted us a price. And what we said to them was, we had budgeted out a certain amount of money in our pre-development budget for that cost. We said, if you want the business here, you're going to put a cap on your fees. That is no matter what happens here, that is the amount of money you're going to get. And they took the deal. It was a very good firm. I think it was Elise Wagner is her name. She was an excellent real estate land use attorney, but she worked with us because she knew that we only had a certain amount of money available for it. And they agreed to put a cap on the fees so it wouldn't run wild on us. And it ended up taking, unfortunately, as I noted, it took longer. So there were more fees in that, but they were comfortable with it. They believed in the project. And I will say this, they did an excellent job guiding us through it. And so when you're looking at professionals, and part of that is, and we can talk about this in your pre-development process, how do you make sure things don't go way off kilter in terms of budget? That all of a sudden you're looking at, well, we have X amount of dollars in our pre-development budget, but everything is blowing up and going beyond that. So the key is to work that out as much as you can up front with the companies that you're contracting with, and to try and make sure that they understand that there's only so much money in that budget and they need to do the work within that budget. And we can't have overruns. Now, like every other nonprofit, most of our money and where we put our money is into services for our clients. Fortune sees 9,000 clients a year. We have a huge service budget. So there's not a huge amount of money available to fund pre-development costs for a project. So we've been very lucky. We found two credit facilities, which have been very good to help us fund our pre-development costs. One is called DPAF, which is run and administered by Enterprise, which we have on our project. It's an excellent facility. It's a low interest rate, and they are very, very responsive. And we found it to be an extremely useful tool for us to help fund the pre-development costs until we get farther along in the process. We also had a pre-development loan two pre-development loans from Leviticus Fund, who is a mission-oriented, faith-based lender. I cannot say enough about them. I have so much respect for Leviticus. They are big believers in helping to facilitate housing development for people with criminal justice history. They are very willing partners. And I would tell you that if you're looking at pre-development funding, you couldn't go wrong with Enterprise or Leviticus, and they're both partners in our projects. And but that's a key, because you need that money to push the project along. Architects don't work for free. The environmental people don't work for free. The land use attorneys, the consultants, they don't. But having that money and that facility allows us to get there. And the way it works is that these pre-development loans will, when you get to your construction and permanent financing, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, these pre-development loans get taken out and satisfied. So they are the way that we can, as a nonprofit, have the ability to be the developer in these projects and be able to fund these initial costs, which are quite expensive. We're looking, and John can talk about it, tell you as well, most of the time you're looking between $800,000 and $1 million in pre-development costs easily on a good sized project. And you know, this is the way we have found that helps create the necessary funding for us to get through this phase of the development. Next slide. Construction and permanent financing, which is gets to be very complicated, and I don't think probably too much to address in this webinar, but I want to talk about the different players in this and where you can look for, because it's a puzzle. It's funny because we was talking about, we're doing this conversion of a legal hotel to a permanent housing on the Upper West Side. And we had approached, we had thought about, could we do this as a tax credit deal, meaning going to the state for tax credits, or going for a bond deal to an entity called HDC, I think it's Housing Development Corporation. And it was funny, they came back to us, and because it's not a huge deal, we were too small. And we needed about $12 million to make this work in our capital stack the way we were doing this, and they wouldn't do it. So I thought $12 million is a lot of money. So to me, I thought that didn't seem too small to me. But for some of these entities, they're used to doing these deals at larger numbers. So we had to be creative there, and we found a private lender who was going to come in and do the $12 million, and was more than willing to do it. It's a little small for them as well, but they also understand doing this. And if we're able to show that we can take an illegal hotel, convert it into, which was an SRO, and convert it into permanent supportive housing, that may be a future pipeline to getting housing quickly into the market, so that we can get people who have criminal justice history housed. That's one of the other issues with this. And when you look at, and we have experience now in multiple areas, new build takes a long time, and it takes a long time to get that to market. So one of the things we're looking at is, how do we repurpose buildings that we have now in the city to get them rehabilitated and brought onto the market quickly, so that we're housing people faster at a lower cost. And that's our project on West 97th Street, which is the illegal hotel conversion. But I will say this, there are only 2 of those projects going forward right now. It has been difficult meshing together the different parts of the city bureaucracy to make this project work. And John and I were actually on a call right before this, and they're just, as we go through this, there are more and more things to work out with that. But I can talk about that later. That's an interesting project where HRA DHS is repurposing the master lease contract, which is mainly used to help build purpose-built shelters, fund that, to now fund permanent supportive housing. So we are meshing, if you can believe this, HRA and DHS with HPD, with HHAP. So I know that's the alphabet soup. So you have housing, you have HPD is the housing preservation part of the city. And you have HHAP, which is a funder through the state, which provides funding, additional capital funding for these types of projects. And also meshing that with DHS and the Department of Homeless Services, who has the master lease contract and a private lender. So somehow that puzzle for that project is working, and we're hoping to go to closing in May or June. But that's the problem here in a lot of ways, is that we spend a lot of time trying to take different bureaucracies and have them work together and understand how a project, that sometimes one department has to, because they have a rule that may conflict with the other department, how do we get them to find common ground so that we can go forward with the project? But as you see on the list here, when you're looking at construction and permanent financing, you have usually a private bank lending part. You may have funding that comes from HPD directly, capital funding, or state funding through HHAP, and or you could have tax credits, which are through HCR, which is the state division, which handles the issuance of low-income housing tax credits. But we've also found this, which is interesting, because this space there is such a mission to help this population. We have gotten foundation support for our projects, especially the one we just did in West 97th Street. Trinity and the Weinberg Foundation have both put money into the project because they see the value of trying to create this pipeline, an understanding of how to create this type of housing. So we are repurposing buildings that are already in existence and bringing them to market quicker than doing a new build, which takes, you're looking at 5 years probably on any project to get a project open. So that's part of the thinking process now, is how to be creative and how to get housing to the market faster at a lower cost. Next slide, please. All right, so generally, once you have two parts to the financing, depend on most deals, you'll have your set of construction financing, which is how you get the project either built or rehabilitated, which then ultimately converts into permanent financing. The permanent financing is what the building will need to have to carry going forward as debt on the project. So one of the key issues you have to think about in terms of a building's health is, will it be able to afford, through its funding sources, to cover that debt service, to cover the maintenance, to cover the insurance, to cover all the costs of operating a building. So on the front end, you have to look at how much is it going to cost us to build this project or rehabilitate this project. But secondly, once we get beyond that, how do we make sure that the building is going to be healthy over its lifespan? Or at least what we look at is the first 15 years and then the next 15 years. 15 years, and as the slide notes, is important on a tax credit deal because there are things that happen at year 15 where the investor may leave, will leave the project, and how the tax credit investor exits the project is in year 15. And it's also where there are issues around repairs and things that need to be done to the building. And so that's a whole separate discussion. But you have to look at, when you're looking at this project, not only from pre-development to the construction, then to the operation, and then to how the building is going to live over that period of time. So, but that all goes into the calculation of creating the building and creating the project. And that's why it's so important to have good professionals engaged who can help you create the documentation you need, because lenders, funders, people who are financing or entities financing this project are all going to see how this building looks over a period of time. And you can understand, if you're from a lender perspective, you want to make sure you get paid, and you want to make sure that that building will be able to pay the debt service. But besides that, it also has to be able to, we want it to be able to be at a certain level, that where you've seen underfunded buildings, what happens is then maintenance is not done. And then the buildings start to develop problems over time, maybe with their elevator, maybe with issues in terms of plumbing or electrical. So you want to create a building that is that will operate over time. One of the other issues that you have to look at now is that you want the building to have certain environmental features, that it, in terms of energy use, in terms of how it operates. So that now all gets factored into this. We've been lucky that we have been brought into a pilot program on solar energy and electrification of our buildings. So we are making a very big effort to make our buildings as environmentally friendly as possible. But it also goes from, you know, if we're able to do that, it also cuts down the electric costs, and we are able to, in our West 97th Street project, remove the boiler. We're doing a full electrification of the building. But all of these are issues that come up in how you develop the project and how you factor in costs, how you pay for things. And I will say this, one of the issues we've really suffered from in the last couple of years are heavily increasing construction prices. The cost of goods and services in order to build these buildings has been going up rapidly. So when you look at, you know, on our new build, we priced this out years ago when we started, we created these budgets, but it has just steadily gone up and up and up. And it's going up. I can let John talk to that. He's on the call here, what we're seeing in terms of cost square foot, but it is steadily increasing. And it is in a very, it's been very difficult to keep our budget in line for these projects. And we've constantly had to be in discussion with our funders about how this is shifting. And they know this too, because we're not the only project going through this at the moment. But it's very difficult when you're trying to, you know, figure out your cost of construction, and the prices can almost change on a daily basis. So we could have a discussion separately about what we're seeing in terms of these things. Interesting question there on the Inflation Reduction Act. It really, we haven't done that, I have to say. It would be something we should probably look at, but the reality we're facing is there's a two-pronged problem. You have construction costs going way up, and then interest rates are going up as well. So it's a double whammy for real estate development. Yes, and Jeff, the interest rates are having an effect on this, because, you know, the cost of money factored into the project is going up every time the Fed hikes the rate. So we're trying to, I know on our West 97th project, as soon as we can, lock our rate in so that we have it. But it's been such volatility in the market that you don't know. You're concerned that maybe rates go down, and you don't know what's happening. And it's another variable that we have to factor into our budgets. So I wish I had an easy answer for it. It's something we struggle with every day, and it's not an easy answer at the moment. This is not a great time because of this instability in the credit markets, and also the increased costs and shortages that in terms of construction materials are affecting pricing. So it's not easy. On this slide, I would say when you get, this is where you can get more information about each of the programs that we look at. These are all extremely important parts of how you put together the financing for the project. And I would say take a look at the information, but this is part of how you factor in, where is there available funding? What is that funding going to look like? What is it going to cost you? How does it fit in with the other funding that you're looking at in the building? As I said, it's one large puzzle that you have to put together for every project, because it's going to be different for each project. Next slide. Now, for supportive housing, it's not just pre-development money, it's not just construction and permanent financing, it's also where you're going to find the money for supportive services and an operation of a supporting housing program. On here, I will say these are the ones that we've looked at and have incorporated into our different buildings. New York City has what's called the 1515 program, which is a good program, but I will say this, there presents an issue. That program has the chronicity problem. So when you're looking for individuals who are going to come into living in units sponsored with New York City 1515 subsidies, they have to be chronically homeless. So how do you have chronicity when, for this population, when they don't count time in prison or jail towards chronicity? So it puts those individuals at a big problem when they're coming out of incarceration, that they can't move into units supported by the 1515 program without gaining chronicity. One of Fortune's answers to that, and it's why we went down the route for the DHS shelter, is those people who reside in the shelter, especially our shelter, will gain chronicity during that period. So then eventually make themselves eligible for units that are under the 1515 program. But that is not the case with ESHI. There is no chronicity requirement with the state, but the problem is they pay less money. And we are working very hard on an advocacy side to get the ESHI program to increase its rent subsidies. The money they pay is not sufficient for units in New York City. They are at, I think, $17,500 per year. And you cannot do services and have a rent subsidy for that amount of money. So, and I'm not sure exactly, I think they are working at getting that number up from ESHI. And why 1515 is better, it pays more money towards the rent subsidy and the services. So another overlay is also the inclusion of Section 8 vouchers. Those provide solid, good funding in a building. They're very hard to get, and yes, exactly. It does. Thank you, Sarah. And it's the Section 8 vouchers are a very important piece to making a building cash flow properly, but they're very hard to get. And I think there's, and right now, even talking to HPD today, there's a very finite amount they have, and they are very, it's very hard to get them to give them out. So I will say that it's a great thing to have, but hard to get. But they, if you can get them, they really do create excellent, create more, they create better cash flow in the building when they're in the mix. But this part is also, you know, this is the complication of doing affordable and supportive housing, is that you're not only looking at the front end, your pre-development costs, you're not only looking at your construction costs and your permanent financing costs, but you're also then having to look at how are you funding the units, and is the building going to cash flow enough to cover debt service, maintenance, insurance, all the operational side, while also providing funding for the supportive services we need to do. I will tell you, Fortune's philosophy on this is that we leverage other programs in. We know that there's just not going to be enough money for supportive services in most of the projects. So we are lucky that we're able to take other parts, service contracts we have, and leverage them into the project. But it is a puzzle that we are constantly having to adjust. But take a look at the websites for these different projects. They are very, I would say this, the people who run these projects, who are involved in administering them, are very helpful. If you have questions, call them up or email them. They are more than happy to talk to you about how that type of funding could fit into your housing project. And we found them to be very willing partners and very supportive of this type of work. Yes, it is an opportunity for advocacy. One of the other ways that we close the gap on funding is philanthropy. We fundraise heavily at Fortune. We're looking at different opportunities to engage foundations, to engage individuals, because this is so important. And I think it makes a very compelling case to foundations and individual contributors about the need for this type of housing and how it is central for successful reentry. And I think what we know is that the cost of incarcerating someone in prison is so expensive for the taxpayers, but it's so non-productive. So if we can have people successfully reenter and become back into society, reunite with their families, have quality jobs, get the education they want so badly, and they get them the mental health and physical health services, do all that holistic part of it. But the key to it is housing, because you cannot expect an individual to engage in the work to get job training, the work to deal with mental health issues or substance use problems, if every night they go and they have no idea where they're going to sleep, or the place they are sleeping in is so unsafe that they are fearing for their lives where they're living, then you're not going to have a successful reentry. So we know the literature, the academic literature is clear on this. For every outcome, housing stability is needed. So that is a very compelling issue when we talk to funders and we talk to different foundations. This resonates with them. And I think there's a large opportunity, an untapped opportunity, to get philanthropy more involved in these housing projects. Next slide. This talks about foundations. I think we need to be looking at more and engaging them in this, because many foundations, what they're concerned about is bang for their buck, meaning, are they going to get real outcomes for the money they're putting into different projects? And there is a large bang for the buck in housing. It provides so many positive outcomes when you provide safe and affordable housing for people who are reentering. So I think it's something that we can, as a group, look at, but it's one of the things we talk about all the time when we're talking about our housing projects. Are there places we can go to get foundations engaged, to get individual donors engaged? And I think there's real opportunity there that I know Fortune's looking at. I know a number of other nonprofits have looked at as well, and bringing that into the funding mix for these projects. Next slide. And there's also corporate entities. And I think it's very important that we haven't looked at corporate partnerships as well. We've seen it in other areas of our reentry programming. We've partnered with Google, we've partnered with Microsoft in our employment services. We've done a lot of different things where we're able to engage large companies into this space. Where I think we haven't engaged them into the space as much is in the affordable supportive housing areas. And it's an area I think of an area that we need to invest more into and look at engaging corporations into this type of work. So I think it's something in the future that nonprofits should be looking at doing and seeing how we can get them to be a part of this. Next slide. That's the end of my presentation here, but I just want to say this. We need as many nonprofits to get into this field as possible. It looks daunting for many, and people look at it and think, wow, this is too much to do. But with the right help and engaging with good quality professionals, but also tapping resources within the state and the city, it's something that can be done. And we are big believers in this at Fortune. We have made a heavy investment of our resources into housing because we know how important it is. And we hope that other nonprofits and can figure out ways to get into this space, because we desperately need housing for this population. And every effort we can do to get that done, is so important. And we appreciate everyone being on the webinar today and having an interest in doing this. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I know folks have been putting questions in the chat, but before I pass it over to Katya, are there any sort of quick questions folks want to ask? And you can come up of mute or put it in the chat. Otherwise, we will reserve a Q&A session at the very end.
I guess I just have a kind of quick question about like your pipeline and how you guys kind of go through this. Like my background is in like private for market development. So I've been where I'm at here at BCS for like 2 years, and we're finally able to go after land and be our own developer. But it's very different for me, at least, than being able to underwrite an entire deal myself. And there's just so many more things to do. So as I would hope as time goes on, we will build out a bit of a team that's more than just myself and our consultants. But maybe you could kind of talk about, how you guys have been able to do that and be productive. And
we kind of just built on. We started back in 1998, 2000 with our first 2 buildings, and then we had a period where we didn't do as much development, but we went in for the RFP to the city, and what started this whole project was that we got awarded the land through the RFP. So, for that project, and along with the project we did in joint venture with the for-profit developer, we did it with what we had available in terms of people and resources. And we relied heavily on our consultants and on the architects and on the different professionals. But we realized at a certain point where we had enough in the pipeline that we had to add some staffing. And John Smallwood, who's on the call with us, we brought him on recently, last September, because we couldn't do it ourselves anymore. We needed help. It got to be too much. These projects are, in terms of what they require, become too daunting. But we waited to see that we had enough in the pipeline, enough developer fees in the pipeline, because let's be honest here, this also, for us, is a way of bringing funding into our agency through the developer fees. And that helps us to fund other programs and provides us with for Fortune, non-restricted funds are very important. We have many funds that come into us through contracts for services we provide, which are restricted to certain things that we can use them for. But when you get some non-restricted funds, which can help leverage the shortfalls in our other programs, those are golden for us. And part of one of the positive outcomes, besides the fact we really desire housing for our population, is that this also provides additional funding that we can now deploy across our agency to help shore up other areas where we have under-resourced programs. So in the short of it, this is an organic evolution of we are constantly looking to make sure that we have things at different stages in the pipeline, so that we're opening things every year and a half. We're trying to stage it out so that the developer fees come in, they help support and underwrite the costs of the people who work on these projects, but also provide additional funds for our other projects. So that's how we kind of doing it. And I wish there was a rhyme and reason for it. We're just kind of feeling our way through it.
The other thing too, it's been talking about that is, we're unable to be everywhere. We love to be a national housing provider and are obviously doing that work to some degree. But what we do is we replicate our work, right? Through partnering with other organizations, right, in different states to support them building out that model, right? We work with an organization in Syracuse, New York, and their model is exactly similar to ours in New York City. So we offer technical assistance to them so they can roll out a program like that. And we're looking at Oklahoma as another state as well to offer technical assistance to support people, because we know we aren't able to reach all states necessarily.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Ben. All right, so passing it off now to Katya, who's the director of Loan Fund with Enterprise. Oh, Katya, you're muted.
There we go. Hey, everybody,
you go.
good to be here. So just a 2-second background on Enterprise Community Loan Fund. We are a community development financial institution, or CDFI. So we're a nonprofit, mission-driven lender, one of maybe a dozen in New York, providing various types of capital solutions for transitional and permanent supportive housing projects, among other types of projects. And then, as Ben noted, we're also an originator into the New York City Acquisition Fund. So, Ben touched on this, working with the right lender and understanding how to work with a lender and a lender's expectations is really critical in getting your project done. So your funding needs are going to be focused on kind of 3 key components. One is getting it built, so taking down the land, financing pre-development and construction expenses, ultimately securing permanent debt that will be with the property in the long term. Second is funding to keep the property operations in a healthy, sustainable way. So this will take the form of public operating contracts, other resources that will fund services. And then third is rental subsidies or another kind of source of operating subsidy. So I'm going to focus on the first bucket, which is capital needed to build the building. So this is the area where you'll be partnering with a lender on. Next slide, please. So this is a kind of simple presentation of the lending and development cycle. So there are several phases of the development cycle where you might approach a lender for financing: acquisition and pre-dev, construction, and then the permanent phase. You'll note on the diagram that the level of perceived risk by a lender tends to correspond to the stage of development, and it kind of progresses from riskiest to lowest, from riskiest at the early stages to lowest risk at the permanent stage. The earlier stage of pre-development stage is naturally considered to be riskiest because at this stage, you, the developer, may still be building out your budget. You don't have your construction bids back necessarily from contractors. The cost of construction is kind of still up in the air. You're still maybe thinking through your capital stack, and you don't necessarily have any financing commitments in place for the construction. And so, as a result, this type of very early stage pre-dev capital, for which real estate security is not available, tends to be scarce. I know Ben mentioned DPAF, and CDFIs like Leviticus and Enterprise do have some limited unsecured pre-development resources, but these sources tend to be finite. And I just want to make sure that your organization kind of has realistic expectations around funding your pre-development needs. And you may want to think about reserving some balance sheet reserves, especially for those very initial feasibility phases, kind of, scoping the site, working with an architect on a zoning analysis to understand what can be legally built on it, and kind of those types of early stage activities. And I will also just put a plug in, if your organization happens to, it's not common, but happens to have some unencumbered real estate, land, or a property that could secure a pre-development loan, that could make access to pre-dev capital much easier, and may also have favorable impact on the cost of the capital. Next slide, please. So these are kind of 4 buckets of a lender's, how a lender assesses risk in connection with a particular project and product, the loan product. So what should you kind of be thinking about in getting your lender comfort with the project and ultimately in making a loan? So first is organizational capacity. So a lender will want to know, do you have the in-house expertise to get the project done? Some of you have deep expertise in providing services, but not necessarily in real estate development. And that's okay. It's not necessarily a red flag or a deal breaker. But in this case, as Ben noted, you will need to think about assembling a strong external team to assist with the project. So development consultants that can help build the financial model, navigate capital resources, an experienced attorney, architect, a contractor that have experience with similar projects. So having a strong development team can really help address lenders' perceived risk that your organization might not have the in-house expertise to get the development project, through the development cycle. In addition to expertise, a lender will want to understand what is your organization's financial health. Do you have a balance sheet that's strong enough to support a repayment guarantee? What about liquidity to cover some of the expenses that debt can't cover? And just something to note, and we'll cover this on the next slide, lenders, generally speaking, are not going to finance 100% of your pre-dev and acquisition or construction costs. So there will need to be some gap financing in the form of either cash or other sources to complete the stack. And there's just a couple of items here on the chart that list the diligence that you should expect to provide to your lender. And I would encourage you to kind of have financial information and information on any kind of prior development experience, should you have any. It's okay if you don't. Anything that really supports or gives the lender a good picture of your financial health. I will also say not all organizations prepare audited financials. Lenders definitely will not necessarily give preference to, but definitely value audited statements. And should you be in a position where you're really seeking kind of to complete a larger scale project, I would encourage you to consider, although there's certainly associated costs with it, but to consider starting to get audited financials. So second is the financing information for the project, something that the lender will want to understand upfront. How are you going to pay for it? What does the capital stack look like? So what the lender will want to see and will ask of you is a detailed development budget, kind of showing the hard cost and estimated soft costs to get the building done. The sources and uses showing the debt and the various subsidy sources you anticipate for the project. And I will note, kind of given the environment we're currently operating in, rising construction costs, rising interest rates, your lender is going to want to see some cushion in that budget with respect to hard costs to get the building built, the rate that you're assuming for the permanent loan. So there's just something to keep in mind. Make sure that your budgets are realistic and have a little bit of cushion incorporated. We'll also want to see an operating pro forma for the project, which shows kind of revenues, expenses, net income for the building projected. And in reviewing the pro forma, your lender will want to make sure your assumptions are realistic and ultimately that the completed project pencils out, which means they can cover its operating expenses and long-term debt over a 30-year horizon. And then also important to be realistic about the project timeline. Most projects we see in New York anyway will be in the acquisition phase for between 1 and 4 years, and then it will take up to another 3 years for the project to be built and stabilized. So it's a very long time horizon, and there's certainly an associated cost to that timeline. So if you're in the acquisition phase for 2, 3, 4 years, there are significant carrying costs that will need to be taken into consideration. Interest carry, property-related carrying costs, or other property-related carrying costs. So definitely something else to also keep in mind when you're building out your budget. So while a lender will ask you for all of these things, we understand, and certainly CDFIs, mission-driven lenders, will understand that budgets can shift, that not all capital sources are going to be known when you approach them. So, having a good sense of the capital stack is favorable, but we understand that, there are going to be gaps, and it's going to be a moving target for a little bit of time. But the more complete your kind of application is to the lender, the more responsive your lender is going to be. And that isn't to say your application will be ignored if something is missing, or if the information seems, I don't know, incomplete or inaccurate, whatever. But it certainly helps a lender, which lenders tend to be busy. They have robust pipelines, to really kind of stop and focus on your project if it feels like it's in good shape and feasible and viable. But again, you don't need to approach a lender until your project is fully baked. CDFIs, especially CDFIs like enterprise, we certainly have some technical assistance capabilities. We can help you. We can kind of share any concerns that we have. We can dig into your budgets and highlight areas where we feel maybe are not fully accurate or need some refinement. So definitely don't feel like your package needs to be fully polished. It's a delicate balance, coming to a lender and kind of just saying, oh, I have a site, I'm not sure what I'm going to build on it, can you help me buy it? Your lender will say no. We really need to understand what's going to be built, is it viable, what is the capital stack going to look like? But on the flip side, we're definitely willing to work with you and help you along the way. And so the third batch of info that we'll want to collect is information on what you're building. So a short project narrative describing the site location, the size, the expected services and target population are all super helpful. It doesn't have to be extensive. 1 page is sufficient typically for kind of an application stage. And then, given the nature of these projects, we'll generally also want to ask you, have you done any community outreach yet? And if you haven't, kind of what is your plan for community outreach? Is there local support for the project, or at least the absence of strong resistance for the project within the local community? And then the fourth batch of information we'll ask for, and sometimes, you may not have all of these materials available, but it's things about the physical characteristics of the site. So generally, this takes the form of third-party reports such as appraisals, phase 1 environmental review, which will demonstrate whether there are any underlying environmental conditions in place at the property, a zoning analysis, which will be prepared by your architect, a survey, and things of that nature. Generally, this is something a lender will want to see somewhat early in the stage of the loan review process. Next slide, please. So just digging in a little bit on financial capacity, the last slide noted that financial capacity is an important component of a lender's risk assessment. So, what are we really looking at exactly? So one, we are looking at liquidity, which is, in my opinion, maybe the most important measure. This is free, unrestricted cash that your organization may have to support the project, and in a worst case scenario, to repay or partially repay the loan should the project not materialize. Aside from cash, kind of another balance sheet consideration is the leverage ratio. This is the ratio of your total debt and other obligations to your equity. And what it is really a measure of your organization's ability to cover existing obligations with your current resources. So the higher the leverage, the risk, the higher the risk perception, the lower the leverage, the better. We'll also look at accounts receivable to kind of assess, do you have significant accumulated receivables that are constraining liquidity, or are your receivables turning in a fairly regular way? We'll look at your equity position. This is another term for a net worth or net assets. It's also the difference between your total assets, or everything that you own, and your liabilities, everything that you owe. So we kind of look at, is equity positive for one? Does your organization have a reasonable net worth, in kind of assessing overall financial strength? And then we'll look at your operating statement. This is also critical. Is your organization historically breaking even or generating surpluses? If you've been posting losses in recent years, it's okay. Just be prepared to explain why and how you're planning on turning performance around. Not a deal breaker, but your lender will need to have a lot of clarity on kind of the context for any historic operating losses and to understand the path forward. Next slide, please. So you're at a stage where you have a site and a vision for the project, and now you're kind of thinking about how will you finance it and how much debt can you expect to attract versus other types of gap funding sources that will need to be identified. So something that is critical is the appraised value of the property. So as noted earlier, lenders will rarely finance 100% of the cost of acquisition or construction. So for a land loan, a typical loan will be sized at somewhere between 60 and 80% of the value of the land. For a construction loan, your loan will be typically sized at 80% of the appraised value of the completed building. And then for the permanent loan, also 80% of the value of the completed building. So inherently, that means that there's going to need to be other types of capital in the capital stack. And I know Ben mentioned a couple of potential resources, but it's just something to keep in mind, particularly at the acquisition phase, that with the exception of some special funding sources and lending products that are kind of at below market rate pricing or above market rate LTV. So the New York City Acquisition Fund being a good example, generally speaking, you'll need to be prepared to come up with the difference that your lender is not going to be willing to finance. And yeah, so generally, I mean, that really just means that at kind of every stage of the development cycle, you'll need both debt and other resources to finance the project. So either cash, grants, philanthropy, or public sources. Next slide, please. We can actually skip this one. It's just kind of a summary of what I talked about, but generally your loan is going to be constrained by the loan to value measure. And then your permanent loan will be constrained not only by the loan to value measure, but also by the permanent lender's required debt service coverage. So the ratio of your net operating income to the monthly or annual principal and interest payments on the loan. So the combination of the value of the property and the property operations is what's going to drive loan sizing for the permanent loan. So a typical capital stack, again, at acquisition, you're typically looking at 60 to 80% in debt financing, and then the balance with is cash, fundraising, grants. If you have a JV partner, perhaps a JV partner can also provide cash contribution toward the acquisition. Just a quick note on the New York City Acquisition Fund. So this is a really beneficial resource for affordable and permanent supportive housing projects. This is a capital source that can lend at up to 130% of the acquisition price, which means that not only is the fund able to finance 100% of the acquisition, but also it creates some additional capital to help organizations finance redevelopment expenses. Of note, this source is only available for permanent supportive housing. It is not available to take down land that is intended for the development of transitional or shelters. And I'm happy to share additional resources on that. That source, ECLF, is a prolific originator into the funds. We have a lot of experience with them and have closed a lot of transactions into it. So happy to connect with anyone who's interested after the presentation. At the construction, oh, sorry, can you just skip one slide, thanks. At the construction and permanent phase, you can generally expect your cash investment or any equity you put in during acquisition pre-development to be repaid to you with construction sources. So generally speaking, that kind of cash equity investment is not going to be permanent in the project, especially if the capital stack is kind of assembled in the right way. So at construction, in addition to kind of private debt or bonds that will take the form of a first mortgage, the gap financing sources are going to take the form of public subsidies, such as from agencies like HPD or HCR, often in combination with LIHTC equity, and then other gap sources you may have identified on your own, such as foundation grants, green energy grants, discretionary awards from city council or president's offices, and kind of soft dollars of that nature. Next slide, please. Actually, let's skip this one because it's kind of redundant. And just to close, and Ben, you touched on this a little bit, kind of the potential benefits of partnering with another developer, maybe one that has a different kind of expertise or deeper pockets. So certainly there are pros in partnering, right? So there's complementary expertise that can be brought to the table. Contribution of capital is huge. It's, you know, it reduces the burden on your organization in terms of the amount of liquidity that it's going to need to be invested in the project. And then the sharing of risk, of course. Another favorable consideration that a potential JV partner might bring is a strong balance sheet, assuming your organization's balance sheet is maybe limited. And that strong balance sheet might give your lender more comfort in making a loan. And then the cons, I think, are kind of a little bit more obvious, right? So, you know, having to share control over the project, control over the vision, having to share developer fees that you may be earning from the project, that, you know, would otherwise be fully paid to you and to help support the liquidity of your organization. So I'll stop at that. And I don't know if we have any time for questions.
Thank you, Katya. I see a lot of the folks actually still stayed with us. So if folks have any questions, feel free to unmute or put your questions in the chat. And in the meantime, while folks are thinking of questions, Emma put in the chat the link to our next session. It's going to go more into detail about the supportive housing resources and the term sheets and the eligibility requirements. So we'll dig deeper into some of the things that were discussed. Yeah, now open to any questions. And again, thank you, Katya, so much, and Dan. And
Thank you.
I know Andrea had to leave, but thank you for sharing your expertise. Oh, sharing a lot of thank yous in the chat. All right, I'll pass that over to you, Emma, now for any closing remarks.
We just wanted to thank you so much again to our great speakers from Fortune Society and Enterprise, and co-hosting this series with you from CSH, Corporation for Supportive Housing. This is our 6th session out of 9. And so we have our 7th one coming up, as Camilla mentioned, on supportive housing funding and financing for development. Digging in some of those more supportive housing specific pieces, and we'll also have a guest speaker kind of share their experience in the supportive housing development landscape. So you'll get to hear some really helpful insight if you're interested in supportive housing development. And I put the link in for that registration. And also we'd love to hear from you on today's session. Thanks so much for the thank yous in the chat. And if you would like to tell us how the session was great, please click on that survey link. And otherwise, we'll see you on March 21st in just a few weeks. And thanks again, Katya and Benjamin and Andre. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Robert.